Yeah, I do research on the ancient Buddhist tradition of India, and I focus on material culture, material remains, monuments, history of art. So through this evidence, I try to reconstruct ancient scenarios, and based on that, it appears that really in the early centuries, around the beginning of the Common Era, Buddhism was a major religious tradition in India. Quite a number of Buddhist monuments known as stupas, Buddhist cave temples were carved, and even though around that time we don't really have a representation of the Buddha in anthropomorphic form, we have an abundance of material evidence that also speaks of interaction between communities who have embraced different religious traditions. So, for instance, when we look at ancient Buddhist stupas, relic mounds associated with the Buddha, we do find in the decoration and ornamentation of these monuments quite a number of deities that are not necessarily Buddhist, if we want to be giving labels.
Right.
So we have a number of yakshas, yakshis, nagas, and so this gives us a sense of the dialogue that existed at the time among different communities, or at least perhaps same communities who embraced or worshipped, perhaps even at the same time, different deities from different circles.
So the categories that we have today of Hindu and Buddhist, for example, perhaps didn't exist in the same sort of way earlier than they do now.
Absolutely. I think those are actually pre-modern categories. I think in antiquity, Buddhists did not see themselves as Buddhists versus Hindus.
Right.
Okay, so these are products of modern and pre-modern thinking. I think at the time, people just followed, for instance, worshipped Laukika devatas, gods that protected places, and auspicious deities for good luck, for abundance, for fertility. And there were all sorts of rituals associated with that. And at the same time, they may have also worshipped Buddha. I don't think the two things were seen in sort of against each other, but they were actually all part of this very diverse and rich religious substratum of India at the time. So these categories, I don't think existed at the time.
You spoke about the focus on place and certain divinities being associated with certain places. Could you speak about the relations between a stupa, for example, and the environment around it? Or
absolutely. I think in ancient India, place really defined identity. Place was a key element to establish the nature of a community. It was important to worship deities from that place. And also, I think when we look at Buddhist monuments, they become integral part of the landscape of their placement is actually key. Situating a monument in antiquity was a tremendous relevance. The siting, the integration between the architectural, the man-made and the natural-made was really fascinating. And I think to that extent, not only stupas, but the Buddhist cave temples really speak of that seamless integration of man-made and natural, where these monuments are almost as if they are, swayambhu, sort of naturally occurring in nature, and therefore even more powerful. And so I think that environment, placement, were key components of the nature of a monument.
You mentioned the word swayambhu, the idea of it emerging from the landscape. Could you speak about the difference between rock cut and structural architecture?
Absolutely. In a way, rock cut monuments sort of emerge out of the mountain as if they're naturally occurring, where the sort of it's the negative space we are kind of removing. There is no addition in a rock cut monument. Okay, there is just sort of removing the excess and revealing the shape of the monument that in some ways is almost implicit hidden in the nature of the rock. And so the human intervention reveals this form, that it's inherent to to the landscape.
Right.
When we come to a built monument, we do superimpose our presence onto the landscape in some ways. And it's clear that they made efforts to kind of perfectly integrate monuments with the surroundings. But in that sense, it's more of an addition than a subtraction. And so it's us shaping the landscape versus the landscape shaping the monument in the case of the caves.
Right. And is this something that was seen in early Hindu caves as well?
Yes, definitely. And we have evidence of Hindu cave temples, especially Shaivas, Shaiva temples in Maharashtra, in the area of Mumbai. Here, Elephanta is a great example. Okay. We can also think about Ellora, of course, as with the Kailash temple as a great example of this idea of Swayambhu, as if, the cave Kailash, not it's the monument emerging out of the rock cliff, in a sense. Because it's like a monolithic structure that kind of raises us, sort of appears out of this cliff. And I do think that this was actually, again, because this distinction, Hindu and Buddhist, are in some ways arbitrary when we apply them to the past. What actually applies to the Buddhist caves applies to Hindu caves as well, because there were no differences in a way. It's just... it's just this sort of concept of nature and divinity that kind of meet in landscape. And this is true, I think, for the Buddhist tradition, for the Hindu tradition as well.
Right. So perhaps instead of saying that the Buddhists have contributed much to rock cut architecture in India, we can say that the practice of building rock cut structures, not structures, but rock cut environments for the worship of Buddhist deities contributed to.
Certainly. We also have to think about the fact that some of the earliest caves or rock cut structures were actually associated with the Ajivikas in Madhya Pradesh at the time of Ashoka. Mauryan times we have inscriptions associated with these caves. So I think that caves in the Indic world were extremely important places for all sorts of religious practices. They were important for, of course, as an ascetic retreat. And I think caves were powerful places where important transformations happened. And if you think about the power of actually transforming the sound, think about meditating in a cave and the echo, and think about the light. Think about this idea of going from light to darkness and to this new environment that is sort of a womb from which you come out and you're a new person in some ways. So there are all these implications that are really fascinating. And I think they start to emerge very early in the Indic world. And it's just, I think, that within the Buddhist tradition, they articulated that more clearly. And also they had a great tradition of support and patronage that enabled them to really go strong and start to carve these sites along the Ghats, for instance, in places where there was patronage support and all sorts of interest for that particular tradition.
Right. So would you say that then the people of that time had a different relationship with the environment that we do today? Because sometimes we feel excluded from the environment.
I think so, definitely. There seems to be a much more of a symbiotic relationship between the people of the time and the environment. Also, I think one important role that these Buddhist cave temples perform was to really open up new land at the time, because today it's all open for us. But in antiquity, think about the jungle or the Ghats. Think about the Deccan Plateau up on top, covered with vegetation. So think about these caves as an interface between all the sort of more urban, or at least perhaps developed coastal area, and this hinterland that was kind of wild. Also think about an interface between the forest dwellers and the urbanized. Think about the kind of also products from the forest that were important to the settled communities. Perhaps medicine was an important element of it. All the sort of natural products that this kind of forest communities could contribute to the monks. And I think in that way, these monastic settlements in the hills also function. I mean, that's why medicine is something that thrives in Buddhist communities. It's because I think there's a lot of exchange with this dwellers that occupy jungle, no plants, and provide to the settled communities also all sorts of products that they needed for all sorts of reasons.
And perhaps we can also keep in mind that someone who was going to these caves on pilgrimage would have to journey through this environment in order to get there.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that was very important. And in
Right.
fact, they're located at key places. Think about Junnar, the Buddhist caves at Junnar, right next to the famous Nanagat, this important pass that was, exploited and was very much thriving during the Satavahana period. And the road was paved, and you still can see that today. I mean,
Right.
the ancient cutting of the road of the Satavahana period. So absolutely, they were important along important roads and contributed to opening up new land.
Thanks for checking out Art Story with PK. My name is Paritosh, and I created this channel in order to share content with you on the cultural past of India and our world. If you like what you see, please go ahead and share, subscribe, and check out my other social media profiles. And if you have any comments on the content I create, any questions, please go ahead and reach out to me.